Hello everyone. I think you should all be able to hear me now. Uh, Rojbash, Vida Mubash. I hope you all well, and I hope you've had the chance to tune into the lectures in our speaker series so far. Our guest speaker will be presenting on silence as form, navigating forced isolation in Kurdish poetics. My name is Kaveh Gobadi. I prefer to be called Kawa, and I'm an instructor in Kurdish studies at Zahra Institute. And I have also published on Kurdish literature and cinema. I'll be introducing our guest speaker and moderating the question and answer session after the presentation. As you listen to the presentation, I invite you to type questions you may have in the chat box. We'll address as many as we can once the lecture concludes. If you need to step away early or would you like to revisit the talk, a video recording will soon be available on Zahra Institute's YouTube and Facebook pages. And now let me introduce you to our honored guest. Hajjar Baban is a Pakistan-born Afghan Kurdish poet and a winner of the 2025 National Poetry Series for Low-Flying Playing, selected by Jake Skeets for Milkweed Editions. She is the author of Relative to Blood, published by Penmanship Books in 2018, and What I Know of the Mountains, which was published by Anhinga Press in 2019. You can find more of Hajjar's work on her website, www.hajjarbaban.com. With that, it is my pleasure to turn over the floor to our guest speaker, Hajjar Baban. Hajjar, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kawa, for that introduction. And thank you to the Zahra Institute for having me. And thank you all for attending and spending your afternoon or evening with some poems. So the title of my presentation talk is Silence as Form, Navigating Forced Isolation in Kurdish Poetics. I want to start off with these two quotes. So next slide, please. The Kurds, this one you might have heard of if you're familiar with Kurdish identity. The Kurds have no friends but the mountains. And a quote from my friend and also a poet, Lorena Amin, who said, "You can never say you did not understand the Kurds. We spoke all of your languages." So in my book, I have a poem titled "There's No Kurdish Translation or Origin of the Phrase No Friends But the Mountains." It's a poem that considers who writes our history, a poem of lack in a personal sense with my gaps in language. And it uses a translation of the phrase, a Google translation of the phrase, to move along my understanding. The earliest reference I have been able to find of this quote is not a Kurdish origin, hence that title of my poem that I'll be sharing later in the presentation. And so I kind of am a little bit fixated with this phrase, and I like to be generous of my understanding of the phrase and its usage, believing that it's used to highlight the way that Kurds have been abandoned at this state level. But that earliest reference I can find of the phrase is a book, a historical book by John Bollock and Harvey Morris with the subtitle, "The Tragic History of the Kurds." And I don't know, there's something about seeing that word tragic next to history. And there's also something about this idea of no friends but the mountains that kind of puts me in a state of unease. And I think about this phrase often when I think of the idea of forced isolation and the silence that happens when you're not able to write your own history, or you really don't have that power to be heard in that same way. And with Lorena's quote, I think about how despite knowing or having a proximity to the languages of Iran and Iraq and Turkey and Syria, there is a way that Kurds have been marked on the outside. And the limits to legibility. So I wrote, the mountains exist as places of being, of making, even celebration, yet remain as a site that at any moment we may run through, alone, in retreat, where others, words, or bombs isolate us too. For reference, the poet Lorena Amin shared this Instagram story during a time of heightened execution of Kurds by the Iranian regime, and also the recent attacks on Rojava and the displacement many Kurds faced there. I imagine she felt while sharing this horror how little solidarity exists, or even before that's possible, simple seeing. The question becomes, if we speak all your languages, what else is there to do with language, with form? How else to be heard? Next slide, I'm going to be sharing two poems by the Syrian Kurdish poet Jolan Haji, and it's from English translation of his work, and the title of that book is called A Tree Whose Name I Don't Know. And before I get into those two poems, I just wanted to share this quote that's also in the book. We have nothing but this silence with its forgiveness and its cruelty. I feel like this is a really wonderful introduction to what is going to be a bit of a, I know that the presentation title is very fixed, but what is going to be a bit of a complex lecture that's looking into kind of the layers of silence and how that can show up in Kurdish poetics. But that recognition of both forgiveness and cruelty, of a relief and also a loss and violence, I feel like really demonstrates what cannot be understood and all of the pulling and pushing toward the isolation. So I've written here, silence as form in a Kurdish poetics becomes a place to be protected, legible only to those who know, and a reminder of its harsh necessity. So now I'll be sharing two poems. So next slide, please, from Haji's book, A Tree Whose Name I Don't Know. And I also want to say that if you get a chance, you should definitely read this book and all of the books and poems that I'm going to be sharing in this presentation. The title also kind of speaks for itself in terms of this near knowing and this reaching toward something, and all of the silence that exists in that as well. The proximity to knowledge and also a recognition of how far you are from it. A tree whose name I don't know. So the first poem I'm going to be reading is titled Blood on the Stairs. What's this grimace when the cackling stops of a sudden? The river of words is shallow. The dead were swimming in it before you. Stretch your lower lip. Insert the blade. Let speech bleed. Emptiness. Fog is the vapor of a word uttered but never heard. Perplexed women saw a crescent thinner than a spider's thread torn apart by fishermen. Their ears were question marks whose earrings had fallen in the mud, shiny as the eye of a parrot, which has come to learn just a single word, farewell. So as Haji speaks about silence, with Blood on the Stairs, I'm thinking of the cruelty of silence and its necessity. How do you begin to speak up or with or against the dead? The river of words is shallow. The dead were swimming in it before you. But also just that beginning, the silence that exists within the disbelief. Like when you realize you shouldn't be laughing or speaking or moving on from such oppression. With empty nests, I'm thinking of repetition becoming a devastating sound, that shiny as the eye of a parrot which has come to learn just a single word, farewell. There's so much there, even with fog and the imagery of the surroundings, like reminding of that which cannot be said. With Blood on the Stairs, I don't know if this is just because I'm a poet and I'm a writer and I take things there, but I'm also thinking of, and also Kurdish, so I'm also always kind of thinking of elevation and heights, but like Blood on the Stairs to me is also this place of like recognition and the disbelief in being able to go higher or physically move up because of what you are witnessing. There's also like this violence that like has to be enacted to even speak, you know, stretch your lower lip, insert the blade, let speech bleed. And that's something that I'll like will be calling back to as we see other poems. But yeah, I'm thinking about also with all of this, like how much of that is on the reader's interpretation. So the silence that exists in keeping something from the reader. The unheard word in the second poem that we begin with. And what landscape that we can speak. And what is like forever leaving with a farewell. So next, I'm going to be sharing poems from Salim Barakat. So that's on the next slide, who is also a Syrian Kurdish poet. These are from his book of selected poems, The Universe All at Once. They're translated from Arabic by Huda Fakhreddin. And so I just wanted to start off before I get into sharing a longer excerpt of his with these two quotes, fragments really. To cross the mountains is to cross through words the poets have forgotten. These tweezers, to pull the word by its tongue. Again, I'm thinking of that poem, Blood on the Stairs, and the idea of inserting a blade and letting speech bleed when I read something like these tweezers to pull the word by its tongue. And what are like the stakes to force the word out of silence, to pull the word. And with that first quote, actually, to cross the mountains is to cross through words the poets have forgotten. I'm thinking about what is the work of bringing out that speech from the silence of forgetting. And I think that the next fragment that I share, so on the next slide, is really, really beautiful in terms of holding both like that which, like in a Kurdish poetics, of refusing to forget, and also recognizing the sort of like necessity and the conditions that bring you to a place of silence or bring you to a place of loss, and like really, really deep loss. This is also from the same book of poems from The Universe All at Once by Salim Barakat. And I believe that this is from the Grand Ghazal, so I'm sure it's much more beautiful in Arabic. I love them when they know a lot about the white of a tired paper, blank like death, a lot about the wind when it stumbles to make sense, a lot about bread exhausted by its own folly, and a lot about deadly climaxes and the rejuvenating abyss. I love them when they know much that is unbearable to know. I love them when they are a foot beneath reason or a foot above it, minutes before illusion or minutes after it, an arm's length above reconciliation or an arm's length below conflict, a span above the idea or a span below it, a heartbeat below fury or a stone's throw above silence. Barakat forces me to ask what is the result of holding our histories as Kurds, to know much that is unbearable to know. I wanted to share these selections from the Grand Ghazal because it's possible that across borders and even our varying language, we are legible and lovable to each other. For forced isolation, no friends but the mountains leaves no room for each other. And here, Barakat loves beyond reason. I don't know if there are many poets in the chat, but it reminds me of a poem by Aracelis Girmay titled You Are Who I Love. And thinking about both of those poems, or even Barakat's alone, I think of how, of course, a phrase whose lineage we are unable to trace in our own language cannot and never was born holding the complexity and depth of our love and holding for each other. There's so much here in terms of the in between that is captured and also what is not seen or spoken, you know, a foot beneath reason or a foot above it. There's almost like there's not necessarily conditions for that love or belonging in this poem. Recognizing or expelling the other's gaze, we have a place for each other. You know, whether we find ourselves in war or not. A heartbeat below fury or a stone's throw above silence. No matter the distance. So in the next slide, I want to share this poem from this lovely anthology edited by my friend Holly Mason Badra. And I'll actually be sharing two poems from this. And if there's time at the end, I'll maybe share another poem just to wrap things up. Yes, okay, so I wanted to share this poem, A Night with No Country. And actually, on my screen, it's kind of a little bit small, so maybe I should just read it from the book. A Night with No Country, translated from, oh, and I'm sorry, and this is by the poet Joanne Shally. A Night with No Country, translated from the Kurdish Sorani by Arash Saleh and Holly Mason Badra. To get used to this new world is not the problem. Getting used to life is not that simple. I have always said so. If the cosmos is the magical fun of God, then we are, in the best scenario, heroes of a circus. Sisyphus is carrying the corpse of the future, expecting a miracle to become eternal. But life is a sharp nail under the tongue of those days, the days that enforce silence. This is why sometimes, just like a mischievous child, you need to throw stones at God's windows and wrestle with the flames. Just like a gracious dolphin, smile at life, and do not be astonished if the ocean is a sword that sacrifices you in the name of honor. Life is a homeless night, carried on the back of an alley, and I am in a drift car. Listen, night, you need to kneel in front of the warm steps of dawn in order for everyone to recognize tomorrow is not just another day. Another day may be only a concept absconded from the dictionary of deception into the language of cosmos. I am devoid of. I am destiny. Do you remember those nights, hanging in there? You were just like a backpack on my shoulder. Through strange ups and downs, inside the jail, there existed another jail that introduced multiple shadows to my being. The path was not an alley with an opening for escape, but I was a sparrow being passed over by clouds inside the interior of a cold and dark small room, painting the walls with your voice. Where were you? I had a huge risk to take. I poured blood into the veins of time without a prize in sight. I was a fish that was betrayed by the hubris and coquetry of the seagulls. I had to cut off my tail from the claws of that frantic swamp and go. I had to wear the ice of this experience and not burn. I had to follow pages of the age and go and fall off the displaced cheeks of motherland, not to be tears of regret and not to wither. Also, if you do read Kurdish, there is the original in the anthology. I just was not able to share it on the same page, and I didn't want to get confused. But yeah, just starting with this poem, I mean, the title alone, again, is holding so much in terms of the recognition of a sort of lack or a disconnect. And that first stanza that points to that unbearable nature that Barakat speaks to. It's like a recognition of all that could force one into silence and then immediately into directives for the reader to fight this. It's actually like really, I've read this so many times over. It's like a stunning first stanza, just in terms of all of the refusal and recognition, which if I were to title this section of how I think the silence is functioning in this Kurdish poetics, it is refusal and recognition. What is not the problem and what is not that simple. And then I have always said so. And there's like all of those layered contradictions, and also we just get thrown into directions that could force us out and beyond a simple recognition. So, after this image of the days that enforce silence, the sharp nail. Again, I'm thinking of the tweezers that Barakat is speaking of, and the blade, let speech bleed, that Haji is speaking of, and then the sharp nail, and all of that imagery towards the tongue and towards the speech. But then, the really interesting and beautiful thing that happens in Shali's poem is this directive. You need to throw stones at God's window and wrestle with flames. So it's like this recognition and refusal all at once. Even this line, I had to wear the ice of this experience and not burn. And then just also, there's so many layers, and it's a long poem, so that happens, but I am devoid of, I am destiny. And how much happens in that ellipses, all of the silence and the refusal to even have to display what that is and what is missing in the poem into a sort of, as she says, language of the cosmos. I am destiny. So I've written here what world happens in the silence of those ellipses of Sejour. What else to say in a night with no country? Especially when just alongside that silence, I am destiny. There's conviction living here despite the void. There's memory and movement. Despite the silence, Shali's speaker reminds us, and go, how possible another life is. On the next slide, I'm going to be reading a poem that's also in this. So honestly, shout out to this anthology. What a beautiful beginning into, a look at Kurdish writers. That beautiful title, also Sleeping in the Courtyard, very different from We Have No Friends. No shade, but yeah, just a great beginning into Kurdish writing and by Kurdish writers. So I'm going to be sharing this poem. Let me actually also get that from the book. By Pinar Banu Yasher. So this is titled The Relevant Parties. And I'll try to be very quick in finding it. The relevant parties. Kill me, but you must also know that after my death, thousands of Kurds will wake up. Layla Qasim. 1. Means they have the ears of heaven folded. They are calling genocide a bookmark and God's absence a statement, a miscommunication. All people, my people. My people, your people. Is not bread a history? Is not flour unsifted possibilities? 2. I say Iranian because we are taught that in order to belong, we need a country to return to, which is not always the same as the country you are from. And this is one way I am taught to record. Attempts to belong in the ranks of those keeping track. It never makes much difference to the white imagination that I am light-skinned for a Kurd. I am a foreigner either way in America. I say Iranian because in order to belong, you need a country to return me to. 3. A well, a forest, a mirror to only those who have never seen a colonizer before. 4. Headline. Father shot dead, son wounded for saying we are Kurds in Turkey. Reddit comment. No one cares about your family, you stupid piece of shit. My neighbor. You're next. 5. Means I have made it past 22 without tasting prison food. My father still hasn't told me the name of that fruit, but I can hear it crunching, snapping off in his hands, in a place I can never return to. 6. My crimes are many. I am alive. I am alive. I am alive. I am alive. 7. Are they dragging me onto the pavement? Am I running? Running red? Running from death? I am still learning how to. A tree sprouts in my palm, growing bountiful countries. None I may touch without being burned. For linguicide to succeed, I must plant the tree and watch it die. Agonize over what fed, what drank, what failed in me. 8. I say Iraqi because in order to be returned, I have to return to the right place. And there is no right place. So I reach back into the roots and trace the next one, hoping this one won't dry out like the last. To the white imagination, I am still a flightless bird, changing flight pattern, hobbling below my brothers and sisters, pointing to the sky and making shallow graves in the clouds for each word that gets lost in translation. With this poem, I'm thinking of one way I am taught to record, attempts to belong in the ranks of those keeping track. So that quote, that excerpt from Pinar's poem, and the idea of legibility in the face of oppression. I'm also thinking of Lorena's Instagram story shared earlier in this lecture. In addition to our proximity as Kurds to the countries we come out of, there's also a reminder of the refusal that may meet us at any point. Banu moves through countries, headlines, internet forum comments, the speech of her neighbors, the violence in all of it. I'm thinking of Haji's devastating repetition, that farewell, when I read, "My crimes are many. I am alive, I am alive, I am alive, I am alive." The crime of being, existing, and remaining so. Even when there is new growth, there is the possibility of what forces one into silence, what may make speech impossible again in the face of reality. Pinar writes, "Growing bountiful countries, none I may touch without being burned." And it echoes back to Shali's poem, "I had to wear the ice of this experience and not burn." Pinar's speaker takes hold of others' imagination, others' voices and dialogues, and the failure of speech in this Kurdish poetics recognizes each word that gets lost in translation. With this poem and the next poem that I'm going to be sharing on the next slide, I'm thinking about, if the first 3 poems that I shared were on silence as a recognition and a refusal, these poems are, to me, these 2 poems, silence and the impossibility that comes with it. Impossibility in language and, yeah. Answer. After Halabja suffocated, I wrote a long complaint to God. Before everyone, I read it to a tree. The tree cried. From one side, a bird, a postman, said, "All right, who will deliver it?" I won't reach God's throne. Oh, I'm so sorry. Said, "All right, who will deliver it? If you are expecting me to take it, I won't reach God's throne." Late that night, my angelic poem, dressed for mourning, said, "Don't worry, I will take it to the heights of the atmosphere. But I won't promise he will take the letter himself. You know, the great God, who can see him?" I said, "Thank you. Fly." My angelic inspiration flew with my complaint. The next day it was returned. God's fourth secretary down, a man by the name of Ubaid, at the bottom of the very same complaint, wrote to me in Arabic. Idiot, make it Arabic. People here don't know Kurdish. They won't take it to God. When I first read this poem by Shirko Bekas years ago, oh, and sorry, I'm not sure if I said that, but this is by the late Kurdish poet Shirko Bekas. And actually, this is separate from what I was going to say, but in each of these poems, I'm thinking so much about, in place of or because of that silence and that forced silence, there's so much vivid imagery that happens, like where the birds and the trees are speaking and how much life there is in that. But that's an aside, I suppose. When I first read this poem by Shirko Bekas years ago, I knew immediately that it wouldn't leave me, and really it hasn't. I thought of my father who knows Arabic and Persian and Kurdish, and his ability to speak of God in the language that makes it valid not only to other people, but also in the eyes of God. I also thought of the difference that remains between the Kurd and non-Kurd in the countries we inhabit. That we must know another language and never another stepping into our language. And I thought of the use of language and from the use, its validity. I kept thinking of the pulse underneath these words, the tree crying, the poem speaking, the bird, and then this mundane God's fourth secretary down, and the harsh and brief use of the word idiot. So much to think about, all under the context of Halabja, this city known for a massacre, a suffocating, as Bekas puts it. The Halabja massacre, for those watching and unaware, took place on March 16, 1988, where thousands of Kurds were killed by a large-scale Iraqi chemical attack. It was carried out during the Anfal campaign, that some consider a genocide, whose name was taken from the title of the 8th chapter of the Quran, Al-Anfal, or the spoils. There's so much to say about this poem, but I simply wanted to share this poem as a preface before sharing a poem of mine from my forthcoming collection, Low Flying Planes, as it relates to silence, the unbearable knowing, and the isolation that exists even in the face of God. Again, I'm thinking now of Pinar's calling God's absence a statement, and how the Kurdish identity becomes something history alone cannot suffice, and language and God and there seems always something else waiting for us to be measured against. So in the next slide, I'm going to be sharing a poem from my first full-length book, Low Flying Planes. It'll be published in late August. It's really difficult for me to talk about my own writing, so I thought it's like this is the best poem to start off with, especially as that poem by Bekas is so related to that idea of silence and the impossibility that it can have for the Kurdish writer and being in existence. So I'll read it and then I'll say a little bit about it, but this is in the Arabic form by Marwa Halal. So if you're following along, it's read from right to left, like Arabic. Stone to miserable mist, to be read from right to left after Marwa Halal. After Halabja suffocated, I wrote a long complaint to God. The next day it was returned, God's fourth secretary down, a man by the name of Ubaid, at the bottom of the very same complaint, wrote to me in Arabic. Idiot, make it Arabic. People here don't know Kurdish. They won't take it to God. Shirko Bekas. Our language was not riddle, but the idea of our language shook the idea of a place. It curdled, corrupted, spoiled every possibility even before I knew. Empty inside after that period. Trees and a flooded ha to my throat. Laughter gone to be known. Faith, currency to be recognized. To know not a word, but our entire threat. That wrecked not land, but people being wherever we were, existed. Wolves, no one state, take me, before my people relied on God to forever split us from the earth. We had to learn how to hear it properly. Our next nameless flight slanted for something fragrant, never favored to try, away, beyond retreat. The last thought. What core in nationalism that captured minds from crevices taken to sun? So yeah, as I said, this poem is in conversation with Shirko Bekas, his poem Answer that I just shared, and is in the Arabic form by Marwa Halal. I was thinking of silence's impossibility here. After first reading Becca's poem, I knew I wanted to write in Halal's form, the Arabic. It seemed deeply connected in a refusal of being read a certain way, a reading against the English speaker's natural inclinations. In strict adherence to Halal's form, the poet not only writes in right to left, but also includes an Arabic letter and a reference to a word in Arabic. The word seen here, spoiled, does not translate to the Arabic word I have referenced, al-anfal. And the disconnect is an additional layer that hints to those who know, the connection of anfal to halabja, but also the connection of not immediately going to Arabic in a conversation with God, a mistranslation being what costs one life, what additionally marks one outside. The first stanza makes reference to famous Kurdish writer Musa Anter's quote, "If my mother tongue is shaking the foundations of your state, it probably means you built your state on my land." Before my people relied on God to forever split us from the earth, we had to learn how to hear it properly. Language and ownership and what understanding is waiting for us. Another forced retreat. I'm just looking at the time, so I'll be going to the next two poems, and I won't have that much to say. So next slide. I won't have that much to say about these two poems. I'm just gonna try to zip through them. Because now I'm like, wait, I added way too many of my own poems, but I wanted to share this poem because it's directly in conversation with the idea of silence as form and a forced isolation as it relates to the opening quote or phrase that I shared. And my attempts to engage with it or to really understand it. There's no Kurdish translation or origin of the phrase, no friends but the mountains. Though I wouldn't know what was the original way to say someone wants to keep us still without force. For Father to tell us why we can't see ourselves. They want us to romance isolation, live on the top and not learn to ask for, when taken away, how to take a deep breath. I try Googling the phrase, Kurds, each other. Nothing found of sense. I thought it was safe to know where I came from, but then I learned what the country borders. To spell the land, a country can determine how much of the city is it yours. I've never heard the peak, words in the language they're asking of my mind. I list the tenses, but all that comes is a history already made, someone else decided on. If I search for the first man telling to my past what appears when we ask what happened, what we want, not to seek another, John and Harvey to write our tragedy, one British guy is forging the story, and everyone else, ours and not, retells it as true. For years, I'll repeat the phrase, confirm what I fantasize from my father's family. Enough mountains. Reading Ceylon in Dearborn, Michigan. I had no one to choose and lived within the rocks. My mother called herself an orphan after her father had no longer and their home appeared. Though literally through war, the same story seems to fill in me, the language I didn't learn because of what my father's father made, caused disappearance, because there's a clock that for us, no one wants to move, that for us created the word sparse. And then we can go to the next slide, but please let me know if we are a little bit short on time and yeah, I don't know. On hard. Oh, okay. Okay. So I'll read these next three poems and then the final poem, actually, I have a little bit of sort of explanation or, context for it, but if anyone in the Q&A is curious about the poems I haven't explained, I'm welcoming any sort of conversation. On hardness. Then, even after that, your hearts were hardened and became as rocks, or worse than rocks, for hardness. The Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, 274. I was missing something, like having reason to not be as a stone, to learn of a river rather than think of the language my father didn't invite me to. I felt the hardest parts of my body try to rush out from my skin. Forgiveness, I've asked, with my forehead on the ground, trying silence to pray. I'm tired of learning more of what no one can understand. That lavender nearby grows on soil previously occupied by a Saddam-directed prison. Tracy reminds us, of course, Saddam was, yes, a Taurus. That Saddam I wrote a persona poem about in recent years. By recent, I mean as a teenager. I choked on the spoils, but other people died. The knowledge didn't let me hold freedom. I didn't grow from a tree. And then on the next slide, the final poem I'll be sharing. So there's a sequence of like poems titled Low Flying Plains, which is the title of my book. And I just wanted to share a little bit. I'm trying to get better at talking about the book. Sort of where those poems were born out of, and I feel like I'm unable to do that without sharing one, the quote that was in my mind when I wrote the first Low Flying Plains, but also these two epigraphs for the first section of the book. So I'll share that and I'll read the poem and then I'll say a little bit about it. And then, yes. Our enemies say that the Kurds have lived on the mountains for so long, they have rocks in their heads and have become rebellious. like wild animals. Yasin Arif. I build my language with rocks. Edward Glissant. Low flying planes. No contrast to narrative, filing away against my face, the aerial violence, the zone that thinned my center. I was so silent and apart from home, like memory without applause to touch my early spring. Could have been volumes to heal the wound, to roam and fold the corner of clay I knew. I wanted to share this final poem here as it relates to the lecture topic, but like I said, also explains the title of my first book of poems better. Yasin Arif's quote was something I read before, or at the time when the titular poems series began. And it began from this place of conspiracy, a silence in other people's beliefs, and also from a reality of our nearness and connection to the mountains. I had to share it right now as the Kurdistan region of Iraq is being bombed and affected in a war that Kurds have explicitly expressed their interest against. At the same time, despite the heavy bombardment our people are subject to by many differing forces, and the silence in recognition of our affected people, there's also a hypervisibility in conspiracy of our involvement as secret agents, as people theories have to be made on to be understood. Despite our vocal speech and how we are speaking to be understood and wish to be understood. So much of low-flying planes comes out of both the recognition of silence as a tangible set of daily small griefs, and also the existence and beauty and need for our language that we know and create and make possible despite. So that glissant quote, I build my language with rocks. That's the world between these two quotes for me and a smaller, closer look into my book. Thank you all for your attention while I share. I really hope it opens something for you. And yes, thank you, Zahra Institute, for having me.
Thank you, Hajjar, for this wonderful and inspiring presentation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank
We
you.
will now begin the Q&A portion of our event. Please feel free to enter your questions in the chat box. You may also raise your hand on Zoom if you'd like to ask your question directly. While we wait for questions to come in, I'll begin with one of my own. So yeah, I have to admit, when I read your first poem, it took me, I don't know, maybe more than an hour or so. The first poem that you shared is, I think, this is like modernist, postmodernist poems. You know, it sometimes, obviously, maybe that's part of the purpose as well, to make you think. So, but I just wanted to, when I read it, I couldn't. I remembered two things occurred to me. First, there are many short stories, novels, poems about tragedies that Kurds have faced, Anfal, Halabja, other tragedies. But none of them, most of them, in my opinion, have struggled to convey the scale of tragedy. So, and that reminds me of the Kurt Vonnegut's novel Slaughterhouse 5, which is about the bombing of Dresden during the Second World War, which destroyed much of the city. So interestingly, the writer in the opening, you might have read this book. The writer in the opening section of the opening chapter of the novel reflects on the difficulty of writing about a massacre, suggesting that conventional language is inadequate, and that silence actually may, in some sense, be more appropriate. I think that resonates strongly with your use of fragmentation and with the role of silence in your poems and in other poets that you shared and discussed. I, yeah, this was very, yeah, this came to my mind when I read your poem. And then now I move to my question, which is I was wondering how you see this choice of form. Do you use fragmentation mainly to register that suffering or to highlight the limits of language in representing it? And does your style change depending on the subject matter, or is this a is this generally consistent in your work?
Okay, so there's two different
Yeah,
questions.
sorry.
No, no, no. I mean, thank you for everything you shared and also like that quote or that reference. Um I definitely agree with what you're picking up on, both in my work and also what I was trying to highlight with the poets that I shared. The first half of your question was, remind me again. I just want to remember it. You're muted, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was wondering because I haven't it's a shame that I not read your poems, before this event. So I was wondering if you this modernist, postmodernist, or whatever you name it, this fragmented style. Is this generally your approach in your works, or does your style, the form that you utilize, change depending on subject matter in your works?
Okay. I'm just writing it down so I don't forget.
Yeah.
Depending. So I do think I'm pretty drawn to a fragmented style in general, and it could be just where I'm at currently, like in my fixation. I do think also, like, aside from it being an aesthetic for writing, I think it is this kind of maybe answers your second question, even though I have a separate answer for your second question, but I also think it is very representative of my own lack and where me as a speaker has enough information or enough sort of knowledge. So there are a lot of poems that sort of fixate or are in conversation to the father figure. And I think that especially when discussing or trying to write about, like, for example, like tragedies that Kurds have faced, there's an extra layer of difficulty there, or like a need for fragmentation because my father really does not want to speak about all that was lost. Um, as a Kurd, as someone who like faced exile, as someone who has, lost family members. So it's a bit difficult to enter the conversation of what that means, not just as a Kurdish person, but also as someone who is near yet far from that kind of suffering, and not even just suffering alone, but relation to Kurdishness. I don't speak Kurdish, and some of the poems are about that and how that adds another layer of sort of distance. So yeah, so I think it's a bit of an aesthetic thing, the fragmentation. Like I love reading fragments. I shared a couple here, but also the book opens with I don't want to give too much away because you guys should check it out when it comes out if you want to. But it opens with this fragment from Sappho, I would not think to touch the sky with two arms. So I think it's an aesthetic sense. I'm really drawn to fragmentations and short, quiet poems. But I also think the style does definitely change depending on the topic. And there are some things that I find it quite difficult to write about. And when that happens, I feel like I go more in. So that's kind of a bit where the silence comes from and how much more I think I'm able to achieve with that. But yeah, there's so much to say here. That's a really like beautiful question. There was another question too, or were these
I
the
think
two?
that was it. Yeah, that was my, yeah, you answered the question. Thank you very much. And now
Thank you.
we can take more questions from our audience. Okay, let me see if someone has. Do you do you like to read it, or shall I read the question if someone has?
You can, it's fine. Yeah. I think Holly is
Yeah,
raising
I
her
know
hand.
this some yeah. Kimberly says, "Thank you, Hajjar. These poems are so beautiful. As someone who is ignorant to the history of Kurdish people, I recognize an indigenous grief in the writing and words that I feel from my own land and people. So excited for your book." Okay, yeah, this is
Thank you, Kim.
a comment.
That's really beautiful.
So yeah.
I think Holly is raising her hand for a question, or it could just be raising her hand in general, but I don't know if you're able to see that.
No, it's a
Yeah,
question.
yeah, sorry, yeah, Harley is. I didn't. I was focused on the
Oh,
chat.
yeah.
Sorry, I couldn't see. Yeah, yeah, please, Harley.
Hi, thank you for creating this space today. Hello. I can show my face. It was very beautiful to hear you unpacking these poems and to hear the echoes between the poems that you brought up. And I think that you should publish this talk as an essay, actually. Um, that sort of like thinks about the themes and departures within contemporary Kurdish poetry. I think we don't have as much of that as we should out in the literary world. So I think you should do that. Um, but really, my questions may be a little bit of a departure from the talk, and more about the pro like writing your book. Is that okay? Am I allowed, okay, to depart a little bit? So I'm curious if you can talk about, you read some of your poems here. If you could talk a bit about what it has looked like for you to put this book together, to have it selected for this prize to be published, and then if there was anything that came up sort of like in the editorial process, if you could just speak to some of that, I'm curious to hear more.
Just in a general sense of like feelings and stuff.
Yeah, yeah, and like what it's looked like, kind of thinking like timeline from you writing the poems to compiling them to submitting to, anything you want to share.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Um, yeah, I it's a little bit weird. So like there's the, reflection on the book and the publishing, and I feel like that's separate from how I felt like writing it or like um the act of like compiling the poems all into a document and like ordering them and thinking about how they speak to each other. So I feel like that was a little bit of a relief just in terms of seeing my like I've written chapbooks Kawa mentioned in the introduction, and like those felt like very early attempts at what I think I'm like if I am successful, but it feels like actually successful in this book. So I feel a bit of pride, if I can say that, which is very weird because, you know, the title of this lecture is Silence. I'm thinking about that a lot. Just it's a mode that I'm comfortable in, and I actually find, you know, a lot of comfort just in, despite the, like, as the lecture says, like the kind of violence that can recall, but it feels a bit, weird to be sure of the writing and not be able to like edit it more. So there's that, just like, compiling everything. The book, what is now the book, was my thesis for grad school. So it was an experience where I felt pretty isolated, like personally, but I also felt so much ease. I was in a place with mountains for the first time in my life, and I stayed there for quite a bit of time, and like I felt in deep connection with the mountains, but also with the Kurdish poets that I was thinking of. And it was the first time maybe that I was really stepping out of like a writing that I couldn't, feel so sure of, despite like, going through the years, like having recognition or whatever. But it was the first time where I was like, I could really stand behind my work, despite, and this is getting into the second half of your question, which is like the publishing thing, despite its reception. So when I started sending out this book, I received a lot of no's and no's and no's. And actually, this prize, the National Poetry Series, like that I'm being published out of, or that like selected it, was the first time I was a finalist. So that experience was kind of like, I just had to be sure about the book and be like, yeah, this is what I want to stand behind, and then just keep having that belief and sending it out and sending it out. So that experience was a bit like, okay, I was prepared for it and knew this is going to be a little bit difficult, and many people receive rejections. And I've been familiar with rejection on like sending a packet of poems or one or two poems here, but it was my first book. So yeah, so also another like level of pride, which is so weird. Like that's not a word I use often, but for it to be recognized in this way and by such a like a lovely poet that I admire, Jake Skeets, to be the one who sort of saw what the work was doing. I think maybe Holly, that's my answer. I don't know if you had another question in there, but I feel like, yeah, the experience of putting the book together felt like I can stand behind these poems. And of course every poem is still like in revision and never finished, but it felt a little bit more done. And actually I'll share one more thing and then we can get to the next question unless you have more to say, but with that final poem that I shared in this lecture of my own, Low Flying Plains, I wasn't expecting to share that, but I was just thinking of um, Slimani really, and I was thinking of the lack of, I like to put it in any other way, in very simple terms, air defense. Um, and so I felt kind of pulled and called to share this poem. And I think a couple of poems in the book really do that, which is when you realize you don't need to write another poem because you already wrote it, and thinking about that devastating repetition again. There are quite a few poems in the book where I'm sort of reminded, yeah, the sort of repetition and the routine of some of what Kurds, go through. So, yeah, that's been another like sad, but like a weird feeling to have. Like, yeah. So that's another answer to your question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now we take the next question. Bahar has raised her hand.
Yeah,
Yes.
thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I'm sorry I'm not able to turn on my camera yet. I just wanted to share some feelings and a question, if possible. In fact, it's not only about your presentation, but the questions cover imposed here. I personally work on Kurdish media, and I am also trying to follow Kurdish literature. There are, when Kava mentioned, while listening him, I couldn't help myself thinking about the reference to fragments for intellectuals, which is Walter Benjamin and his work on fragments, and that memory, nostalgia, and intellectual depth there, and loss, mourning, and the potential of aesthetics. And thinking of Benjamin, then I started to wonder, recognizing the references you have in your presentation for your poetry, what may there be any connection between what we may call Kurdish visual culture, which consists of media, daily practices, and also art? Is there such a source for your work, inspiration? Are you or do you find yourself in conversation with contemporary representatives of Kurdish art in that sense? And I also wonder, your reference to Sherko Berkbekes and Musa Anter are very inspiring and empowering. But whenever thinking of contemporary Kurdish literature, I wonder how you feel about the young generations who are close to you, who might be standing somewhere alongside your poetry in a sense. And in that sense, I think I wonder how you would feel if I want you to put an emphasis on being a Kurdish woman poet among all these.
Among all these, sorry, what
Yes,
was the
among all these things matters, in addition to all of these layers.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you so much for your question. And if you're able to write in the chat, just the name of the person that you referenced in the beginning, when you were talking about fragmentation and the aesthetics of that. Thank you so much. Uh, how do I feel? And please type in the chat if I'm missing part of your question. How do I feel about my contemporaries in Kurdish literature? Is that part of the question? Am I understanding that correctly? Okay. Again, not to keep shouting out Holly's book, but shout out to Sleeping in the Courtyard, Contemporary Kurdish Writers in Diaspora. I will admit I do sort of have a bias, and this might go back to the title of the presentation, just about silence. I do have sort of a bias or an inclination towards dead poets and writers. There's something about not knowing that much about a person and reading their words, or not being able to project much onto like the literal person and only onto the words. Maybe that might sound a little bit privileged, but I do think that I will admit, a little bit of a bias. Or maybe it's just a current obsession. With Sherko Beka specifically, it's a bit of a layered sort of conversation with him in these poems, or with that specific reference. He was the first Kurdish, I want to say he was the first Kurdish poet I ever read. I think it was in 13 Iraqi Poets, a little pamphlet from Dunya Mikhail. And he was in there. And that was the first Kurdish poem I ever read. So he's kind of a reference point in that sense for me, just as a highlight of the sort of lack of experience and sort of knowledge of Kurdish poets. And also I think there is another layer, which is why I appreciate Holly's book so much, of a lack of access to a lot of Kurdish writers because I don't read Kurdish and I don't know Kurdish. So anything that I would be reading is primarily in English. I would love to be thought of with, living Kurdish women, poets, my age, older, younger, and I'm always happy to be in connection with them and to learn their words. That's something I don't take for granted at all. I'm so lucky to know great Kurdish poets, Holly being one of them, Tracy Fuad, who I reference actually in one of the poems that I shared today, who has 2 books of poetry in English. Pinar, whose poem I shared. So I'm lucky not only to know current Kurdish poets, but also to befriend them and really be in conversation with them. And I'm always really looking for more of that. And your second question is a bit of a personal one for me, as much of Kurdish identity alone, I'm kind of like finding my place and belonging with that. It was briefly mentioned, Kawa mentioned, I'm half Afghan and half Kurdish. And I do think a lot of my belonging with Kurdishness is a work in progress. So to hear your question specifically of identifying as more of Kurdish woman specifically, it just makes me think about these questions that I have distantly in the back of my mind, not necessarily on paper, but definitely as a person and uh, within my personality of what does it mean to be a Kurdish woman and like um yeah, like what does that mean? There's a couple of poems in the book that I haven't shared that are that actually are published. You can find them online that like slightly hint to that question. So I'll say you have to check out the book to have the fuller answer on that one. But yeah, thank you so much for your question.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Yeah, if you want to ask any question, please do raise your hand. Yeah, it seems that we don't have any more questions, Hajjar. So is there anything that you would like to say, Hajjar, before we end this beautiful talk that we had today?
I just wanted to, sorry, I don't know if this is a question or if this was just,
There is a link.
oh, okay, sorry. No, I was just reading someone named Hilla shared,
Yeah, I think they have shared links, so I
oh,
don't think.
okay. Yeah, just thank you all so much for your attention and your lovely questions. And thanks, Holly, for sharing a link to the book. If you are interested in my poems and just reading a bit more, it does come out on August 25th, 2026 in the States. And if you are in a different country, should be able to find it online for sale and pre-order. So yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Kawa, for your questions.
Thank you
And
again.
yeah,
So
thank you.
thank you. Before you go, thank you again. We really enjoyed it. And now that concludes our Q&A session. If you'd like to re-watch the lecture, a recording will soon be available on Zahra Institute's YouTube and Facebook pages. And also, please don't forget that this Saturday, 11th April, Mamosta Matin Atmaca, speaking from Chicago, will deliver the keynote lecture for the Zahra Institute's annual lecture titled The Cultural Foundations of Kurdish Identity in the 19th Century. And our next speaker series event will be on Kemalist colonialist modernity, the Kurdish self, and the notion of Tawhid with Ramazan Aras. And this will be on Wednesday, 6th of May at 12 p.m. Chicago time. To stay updated on our future events and programs and programming, please follow Zahra Institute on YouTube and on social media, Facebook, X, Instagram, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn. Zorspas, Galexpas, thank you all for coming. We hope to see you at our next event. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hajjar.